The jewel of the Adriatic is a gorgeous wonder, filled with masks, bridges, alleyways, and yes, mystery. But there are also ghosts in Venice, often only seen in the brief half-light when daytime gives way to the night. So come with me now and meet some of the ghosts in Venice, and learn more about their peculiar lighting system involving the body parts of the dead in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are kicking off with a new theme this month, and this one was actually chosen by my patrons because I was basically torn between three themes, couldn't decide which one to do, so I asked them. And this one won with 55% of the vote. So we're going to be having a look at ghost stories from 4 different European cities this month. Now we are going to be heading a little bit more further afield than what I normally do, because obviously usually I stick to Britain where I can, or just generally Europe because that's where I am. But I thought I'm going to pick cities I have been to, so I have got some kind of knowledge and awareness of the city. And it only made sense to me to start with Venice, which is probably my favourite city in Europe. I've been like 3 times and it's just fabulous. I was last there in 2017 because I went for the Damien Hirst Treasures of the Wreck of the Unbelievable exhibition, and it was incredible. And while I was there, I also popped into the Libreria Acqua Alta, which is a bookshop, and it's amazing. If you ever get the chance to go to Venice, basically it's this tiny little bookshop and it opens out like onto a canal, and they've got the books in like bathtubs and gondolas and things like that, just in case it floods, and there's cats just sleeping everywhere. It's like my idea of heaven, so clearly I had to go. And I picked up a copy of Venetian Legends and Ghost Stories by Alberto Tosofai as well. And they had it in sort of about 4 different languages, so clearly I bought the English one. And being the intrepid ghost hunter that I am, and I think anyone who's listened to this podcast before will know that when it comes to anything to do with the supernatural, I am generally there like a shot. And I was always the person on ghost hunts where there'd be a weird noise and everyone would kind of lose their minds, and I'd be like, oh my god, what was that? And I would head towards it. So yeah, that's the kind of energy that we're approaching this with. So I bought the book, had a bit of a read, and I was like, oh my god, I'm going out in search of ghosts. Now, while I didn't bump into any spectres as far as I know, I definitely noticed quite a peculiar chill in the air when the shadows lengthened and the tourists scurried back to their hotels. Bearing in mind I was there in July and it was genuinely starting to get quite chilly on an evening. We're going to have a look at 3 ghost stories of Venice, which do come from Venetian Legends and Ghost Stories. So we're going to start off with The Devil Plays a Trick. Now, the title of this tale should give you a clue as to its content, and we're going to start off in the Campo San Martino in the Castello district, and it's quite a small, quiet square, and it's a stone's throw from the Arsenal. Now, according to the legend, a magician lived here between the 15th and 16th centuries, dabbling in the occult arts, and by all accounts, he was a bit of a cruel and brutal man. Many believed him to be in league with the devil himself. One night, he was out later than expected, and he found himself without a light. Now, at first, he believed the full moon would guide him home, and he attempted to navigate the twisting Venetian streets purely by moonlight. Unfortunately for him, clouds gathered across the sky, blocking out any light from above. Now, the magician swore to himself, and he wasn't going to ask any of the saints for help because he wouldn't lower himself that far, but then it hit him. He could ask Satan. After all, the devil is supposed to look after his own, isn't he? So the magician called out to Lucifer, telling him to throw him a torch. Now, the story doesn't add if he said please, but I'd like to hope that he did. But anyway, surprisingly, someone or something passed him a lit torch, which appeared in his hand. Satisfied that his command had been obeyed, the magician continued on his way home. He thought nothing of it when he made it back home, and he left the extinguished torch in the wood box for future use. Now, it is entirely possible that the torch would have lain there indefinitely, were it not for his maids. One day, one of them began screaming for help, and the magician came running, expecting to see some kind of scene of violent bloodshed right there in his home. But no, the cause of her screams was the charred arm of a dead man lying in the wood box. Thankfully, being a magician with a penchant for the diabolical, he actually found the whole affair rather amusing. Now, the tales don't explain what he did with the arm afterwards, but I do actually quite like to think that he kept it to use it again. But this story leads us on neatly to The Helpful Dead, which is our second story. Now, this one concerns the churchyard of the Chiesa di San Francesco della Vigna. Now, sadly, it's surrounded by a massive wall, so I wasn't actually able to take any photos of the churchyard itself. And I should have said this at the beginning, there are photos of all of these locations on my blog where possible that I took while I was doing my little wandering ghost tour around Venice. Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see them on screen. So as I say, I couldn't take any photos of the churchyard itself. But based on the content of the story, I can only assume that the height of the wall is a little bit of a recent addition. Now, one November the 2nd, a man was out late at night, which was in itself perhaps not a wise move, considering the date marked All Souls' Day. Now, All Souls' Day actually dates to the 10th century and was originally the day when families prayed for the souls of their dead relatives. It was also traditionally a time to visit the graves of loved ones. Now, darkness falls early in Venice, its tall buildings blocking the failing daylight. But being a good man, our hero feared robbers lurked in every shadow, and he cursed himself for being out with no means of making a light. Now, the man actually spotted lights moving in the churchyard and hurried closer to see if anyone had a spare. A simple taper would do, but he came to a halt when he saw a parade of men shuffling around the edge of the graveyard. Each held a candle and gazed seemingly at nothing as they moved forwards. One of the men, gaunt and melancholy, seemed a little less entranced and noticed our hapless wanderer. The gaunt man paused before shuffling across the graveyard. When he reached our hero, the gaunt man handed his light to him. "Best not be out here so late without a light," he said. His voice sounded like wind rustling dried leaves. But our hero agreed, took the offered light with many thanks, and hurried home. The following morning he discovered the grisly truth. The light he'd used the night before, which had helped him get home without any problems, was now a dried, shriveled hand. He almost fainted to realise he'd encountered one of the many ghosts in Venice. Still, he wasn't about to rob one of the dead of a body part. So that night, he returned to the churchyard of Chiesa di San Francesco della Vigna. The parade of men continued their patrol around the edge of the graveyard. All but one held aloft their light. The man ran up to the lost soul who had helped him the night before. Swallowing his fear, he held out the dried hand. The ghost smiled, took the offered hand, and it became a light once more. I'm also wondering if this particular story has any links to the English tale of the Hand of Glory, although these hands as candles don't seem to have the same soporific qualities as the English variety. And obviously in Northern folklore, the Hand of Glory was apparently used by thieves to gain access to houses, putting the occupants to sleep. And they were also made in quite a specific way, but the idea of a hand acting as a candle is indeed an intriguing one. And I quite like this particular story because of the fact that the ghost is so helpful, and the fact that the man gives it back. I just think that's absolutely lovely, and I think that's probably my favourite part of the story in general, to be honest. And yeah, I just think that's a really nice one. But while our previous story involved a churchyard within Venice itself, nowadays the cemetery lies on its own island, and we're about to head into our third story for the watery ghosts in Venice. Now, you can see the Isola di San Michele across the stretch of water from the Fondamenta Nove, and it looks quite forbidding when you're looking across at it from, the Fondamenta, and it does look slightly creepy. And again, there's a photo of this on my blog, and I remember obviously me being me, I was like, oh my god, I've got to go and have a look. And there's not a huge number of photos online because you're not really supposed to take photos over there, but I was like, oh my god, I'm going to have to go and have a look. So clearly I did. And I remember the really weird look that the woman selling tickets for the Vaporetto gave us when I asked for a ticket to the Isola di San Michele. Now, the choice of the island for a cemetery does make a lot of sense within a city like Venice because a Napoleonic edict actually forced city officials to bury the dead away from population centres, and the authorities chose the Isola di San Cristoforo della Pace in 1807. 30 years later, they filled the canal between the island and its neighbour, the Isola di San Michele, to create the single cemetery island. And obviously, if you think about it, burying people isn't really an option when you consider how Venice was actually created. And obviously, when you also think about the other islands around Venice, and you've got the various plague islands and so on, you can see why they'd want to keep the dead away from the living. But unfortunately, the island and the waters around it do have links with other ghosts in Venice. Now, in this particular tale, in November 1904, a fog rolled in around the city, creating an almost impenetrable wall around the city. A vaporetto captain reluctantly set off for Burano to take workers home after a long day. 2 gondolas full of people from Murano also set off from the jetty. Now, Murano is literally on the other side of the cemetery island, but Burano, and that's where the lace comes from, is a little bit further away again. But the gondoliers gave the vaporetto a 10-minute head start in an attempt towards making sure that everybody had a safe journey. Now, unfortunately, the fog thickened while they were out on the water, and the vaporetto captain decided to turn back, thinking it was far too dangerous to continue. Unfortunately, the gondolas had caught up in the fog and were right behind him. The captain didn't see them in time, and the vaporetto split one gondola in 2, throwing its passengers into the water. Now, the Burano workers did manage to haul 4 of the passengers onto the vaporetto's deck, but 5 of the female passengers all disappeared. A long search ensued well into the night, at least as well as they were able in the thick fog. And the following morning, rescuers found one woman, Maria Tossobolo, clinging to a post. Sadly, she died minutes after reaching Murano. Search parties also found Lea Tossobarella and Amalia Paravan Vistosi, both dead later that day. Yet there was no sign of the other 2 passengers, Teresa Sandin or a little girl, Giuseppina Gabrielle Comello. In September 1905, so some 10 months later, Teresa's sister reported a harrowing dream. In it, Teresa came to her in the night, telling her that she was bound at the bottom of the canal between the Isola di San Michele and the Fondamenta Nove. If her sister prayed for her, she would be released. So Teresa's sister did as the dream instructed, and prayed for her every night. 10 days later, a battered body turned up in the Bissa Canal. Her sister identified Teresa by the tattered scarf still around her neck, and at least they could finally lay Teresa to rest. Giuseppina unfortunately never resurfaced, although some say she continues to ride the waves in a floating casket lit by candles on foggy nights. Now, that particular story I always find really sad, obviously because of the loss of so many people, although I can't really find much mention of it in the historical record. Instead, most of the news articles are about a disaster involving a steamer in 1914, so the 1904 one does tend to be a little bit harder to find any information about, apart from in Alberto's book. But I do think with that particular story there are enough details that do lend it some kind of feeling of authenticity, or at least believability instead. As I say, it is worth, if you get the chance and you are in Venice, going to have a look at the Isola di San Michele, and you can go to see the graves of like Diaghilev and Ezra Pounds over there and people like that. So it is worth definitely going for a look. But you do tend to find a slightly different attitude in Venice towards the cemetery island compared to if you go somewhere like Paris and go to Père Lachaise, and totally different attitude to the way that the cemeteries kind of are seen as places that people might want to visit. But that's just a difference that you'll obviously need to bear in mind and respect as well while you're there. But I hope you enjoyed those 3 ghost stories. They're possibly not quite as chilling as ghost stories that I've read elsewhere, and I think that was one of the things that I actually quite liked about them, the fact that the first one with the magician, he's kind of like, oh, that's hilarious, and I think that's a really interesting ending to a story like that, the fact that the person actually finds whatever happened really amusing. And I think that the Helpful Dead story, I don't know, there's just something really quite sweet about that one, and I just absolutely love the fact that the guy goes and gives the man his hand back, and I just think that's absolutely lovely. But I think that obviously the saddest one of the 3 has got to be the idea of poor Giuseppina floating around in a floating casket in a really quite large stretch of water when it's foggy, kind of never really able to make it home. And I think that one, as I say, does really get to me a little bit. So that one's quite sad. So next week, we are going to be having a look at ghost stories from Paris, because you kind of can't not go to Paris if you're doing ghost stories. And incidentally, I have just put out a Patreon exclusive episode on the folklore of Notre Dame, obviously in Paris, in case anyone's interested. And you can get that by becoming a supporter at the £3.50 a month or more tier. And there's now 42 bonus episodes to work your way through. So I think £3.50 a month for all that lot is phenomenal value for money. But there we go. As I say, we're going to do Paris next week. I hope that you're enjoying this theme of ghost stories, particularly of European cities. And apart from the fact that obviously a lot of cities do have ghost walks and things like that, I think a lot of the time when we look particularly at English folklore, a lot of the ghost stories kind of tend to be at these big houses and or out in the countryside and so on. So finding them in the urban environment where we're cheek by jowl with them, I think makes them really quite interesting. So I hope that you enjoy that. And also, we have just had the plants month, I know, but if you are interested in poisonous plants, I am doing a talk for free with Cresswell Crags at 6 p.m. British time on the 29th of May, online as well, so it's hopefully going to be nice and accessible for everyone, about poisonous plants and their folklore and legends, so it'll be marvellous to see you there. And the link is in the show notes and all that kind of jazz. But I hope to see you next week when we go ghost hunting in Paris. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.